Hello, everyone. So it's Thursday. It's officially my last day before I go on holiday. And so I picked something really nice. So I welcome Jay. Jay is CEO of Eppo. And so it's great to have you here.
Thanks, Timo. It's great to be here. Excited to chat.
Yeah, it's great. So we already spent, so we had 50 minutes warm up, and I already said, okay, we could have recorded that because like we already had really good stuff. So we are trying to bring this over now in this conversation. And so first of all, for everyone who has tuned in, hey everyone, so welcome to be here. So as always, and I also like will repeat it in between, like if you have some kind of questions, if you have some kind of remarks, also like feel free, put it in the comments. So if technology works, we should see it. Okay, so let me introduce you what I know about you. So let's say the major aspect that I know about you is like you're the founder and CEO of Eppo, because like I knew Eppo. I was really so we will talk a little bit about it and like especially a lot what you do in the whole time. But for me, it was really like again something really great to discover something. Okay, I have all my nice little cool data in my data warehouse, and now I can use Eppo to do experimentation on top of that. So this is what we will talk about a lot. But if we go a little bit back, so I think you started out as a data scientist.
I was. That's right.
Yeah.
Most of my career was at Airbnb. I was the 4th data scientist there.
Okay.
The tagline I like to say is, I was there before we had a data warehouse.
Yeah. Okay. So what did you have at that time?
We had a transactional database replica that we would put SQL queries against, and hopefully they weren't too heavy.
Okay, so then maybe take this. So when was basically the point where you had to decide to introduce something like a data warehouse?
Well, I was a pretty junior person, so I wasn't really a big stakeholder in that decision. But what happened was we brought in some event stream data, and so we wanted to use that. It's from the search ranking stuff. And so we obviously want to mix that with our transactional data, which is the bookings and transactions. And that basically means you need a warehouse. And I think we first set up a pig cluster because we had some ex-Twitter people and they were really into this sort of more functional paradigm. Yeah. That lasted like a month. And then we moved to Hive, and that kind of took off more. And I think Airbnb is still on Hive today.
Okay. So still the Hive times. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I can see that. And so, I mean, what's interesting is like you really started out in this. So myself, for example, I started out in product. So I basically spent half of my time in product, and then at some point I ventured over to data because like I was feeling I do more data stuff than product stuff. And I might go back to product again. So we might come back to this like this transition between the different kind of, let's say, roles. So, but you really started out with data. So was this a longer kind of plan, or like the typical coincidences what life makes?
Yeah, it's definitely a kind of coincidence. I think my career choices have been mostly sort of greedy algorithm, like what is the coolest thing to do at a given moment in time. Yeah. I studied electrical engineering undergrad, so I thought I was going to be a software engineer. Then I got into this whole machine learning AI thing, and quickly saw how it was like a lot of statistics under the hood. Ended up doing a statistics master's degree. In the process, got really interested in a lot of like policy questions. Worked in healthcare policy for a bit on like a very empirical version of it. Then I was like, oh, that's too slow. I want to do something building. And then I joined Airbnb, got back into tech. And I don't know, it was cool. Like I remember when I joined Airbnb, there weren't that many data science teams out there. There was LinkedIn and Facebook, whatever, but not too many. It just happened to be a nice time to be a person with electrical engineering and statistics background.
And you stick with that, I think, quite for some time. So it basically like so
yeah.
So what kept you in data? I mean, like when you talk to data people, you have this, let's say, sometimes like really weird stuff where people are on the one hand super fascinated about this stuff, but on the other hand super frustrated because like all this stuff. I mean, it's always like these two sides, and I sometimes have the let's say the thought that it really takes a specific kind of character to keep to stay in data because of this stuff. So what was your recipe to, or what was your motivation to basically kept you going in the data space?
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I mean, I think I probably have less kind of frustrations than most. I loved it because I believe in a certain way of building companies through growth periods, which is kind of like understand what's working and, build strength on strength and, fix your weaknesses. And that's just deeply empirical questions. So I love that being in data gave you this freedom to like really dive into understanding the business, modeling the business, finding the levers, and then evangelizing the opportunities. If you work in product, you have these extra overhead of like communicating up and down the org, of coordinating the execution, just like making sure that design engineering handoffs go well, et cetera. It was nice to have the leeway to both focus on this problem identification and while not having all the extra overhead. So yeah, I thought it was really cool. Plus, I still have that engineer in me. I like building things. So it was definitely closer to that.
So in the end, you basically got attracted to the kind of speed that you can develop in data. What would you say? So what would you say? I mean, there are so many talks about, okay, what kind of impact data can have on let's say, an organization. And there are still like people building products by just talking to people and do like, I don't know, the kind of Apple kind of approach, talk to people. I'm not sure if Apple talks so much, but Apple basically experiment a lot. And so internally, not with data, more like really figuring out how stuff should work. So there are definitely different ways to build a product. But I totally resonate with your way, and I have my personal things why I think data is super helpful. So what would you say? What is your take? Maybe let's say for a startup, they have product market fit, and they are now basically on the way, let's say Series A. So what is really like where, let's say event data or let's quantitative data, what kind of difference does it make in the whole setup?
So I have some strong opinions on this. I think if you're an early data hire, it really behooves you to, as fast as possible, figure out the growth equation of your company. Broadly, you can kind of bucket most companies into product-led growth, sales-led growth, and marketing-led growth. Usually one of those things is really running the show. If you take something like Airbnb, it was kind of very product-led. Basically, if you got people to book an Airbnb, they tended to come back, they tended to invite their friends, and the whole flywheel came. There are other companies where it's very sales led, where most of the growth equation is like salespeople outbounding, qualifying, and selling. And so the sooner you can just figure out that core equation, the better you can kind of do your tactics. If you're a marketing led company, you're probably going to spend a lot of time on marketing optimization and coming up with pristine definitions of CAC and payback and doing it by segments and by campaign. If you're in product led world, you're going to be running experiments. You're going to be setting up some sort of A/B experimentation program with tools like Eppo that will kind of help you build metrics into the product process. So, to be able to do any of those types of work, you're obviously going to have to lay down a bunch of foundational data infra, your initial DBT model, solve core reporting. But the second you get that stuff done, you plug into the growth equation. That's the way to do it.
But you bring up something which is, I think, really important. And sometimes, I mean, this was the stuff that we discussed before we basically went live. Data is not about building, not only it's about, but it's not only really like about building data warehouses, building pipelines and so on. So because what you just mentioned is like, you just said, you have to figure out what basically, let's say your growth model is right now. So basically how's your business operating at the moment, which I think, let's say by itself doesn't really have so much to do with data. So it has a lot more stuff to do with, in the end, how business works, how marketing works and so on. So how did you do that to basically go across like, okay, I just want to do some, I don't know, just want to create some models, or I want to build a pipeline. So like to take the step, I don't know if it's not really like a step back, but let's say step out of the comfort zone and move over to product, to marketing, or like even like let's say the leadership team to figure this question out, what you just had.
Totally. I actually think it's more straightforward than it seems. Like you're talking about joining a company that's hit some product market fit, right? So they have some history. They've figured out some basic growth questions. I think the simplest thing is just talk to the early team, talk to leadership, and just ask them point blank, like what channel has grown this company most successfully historically? Because I think what you'll find is that a company that has this sort of kind of elephant brain tribal knowledge that from the pre-product market fit days, they know what got them over the chasm and they kind of know those levers. And so what you can do as a data person is unpack the tribal knowledge and just model it in data. be like, okay, so what this company's institutional knowledge has said is that you grow by this thing. I can create a DBT models, Airflow models that basically corroborate that show, okay, here's our growth. Here's where it's coming from. Here are the type of segments that are most indicative of it. And basically all of the ideas behind those things just came from tribal knowledge. Once you have that all modeled out data, that's when you can start to get ahead of it and say, okay, now we can surface new opportunities, or now we can build this tribal knowledge into the general practice of these orgs. Part of the thing about being in product market fit days is that your company's probably growing really fast. Maybe it's like doubling every year. There's a whole swath of new people who need to absorb the tribal knowledge, and you have this unique vantage point to get them in because you have the data.
One thing that came to my mind was like, okay, I think this is, so talking to the people and basically let them recall what they just did. I think this is a really good method, because like it's also pretty easy for these kind of people to do that, because like this is like what humans really can do. They just have to tell, okay, what we did, what worked really well.
It is so powerful because, like, I tell you, I've between the companies I've joined or the companies I've consulted with, you hit this product market fit thing, and now it's like, okay, let's bring in the scaling experts, and they hire some like director of product from like a Dropbox or something, or it's from some Airbnb, or it's just some place that like, okay, here's a high pedigreed product leader. And that person comes in, and whether they know it or not, they start trying to run their own playbook, their own growth playbook. They just kind of like glom it on there. And so you as the data person get to hold the line and say like, I like the tribal knowledge of the original team, you can make it much more powerful because you entome it in data, right? You kind of show the models and show the growth equation, and that can kind of help just quickly get all these other people on board with how this company works.
Oh, that's interesting. So I think this is something that I never really discovered yet, but I think it totally makes sense. So basically, like, you as a data person become, let's say, kind of the sanity check, like the guardrail. So like, okay, this is what works so far. We can see like good performance in these kind of stuff and so on. Okay. And also, like, I think this is also interesting that you can basically be, as a data person, so you can basically the onboarding for everyone into the company
100%.
By data.
Yep.
Which is interesting. I never really saw
100%.
that, but yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and the big thing is, as you all know, with data work, it's like one way to do onboarding is to try to get people to just read a bunch of, dashboards and pamphlets and stuff like that, which is a very hard thing to do. I mean, only a certain type of person out there is just waking up every morning and just diving into the dashboards. Instead, what you got to do is figure out how to plug into those teams, right? That's why I'm such a big fan of A/B experimentation, is that it takes your product process and just like plugs metrics into it in this direct way, where suddenly everyone knows the exact effect of all that product work on a metric. And when you control for all the caveats, when you control for everything else, and you just kind of get every product running through an experiment, it kind of makes everyone reckon with their decisions. This thing worked and this thing didn't. No judgments. This is metric move and this didn't. What do you make of that?
Maybe
yeah.
No, I totally get it. I think this is. I'm just thinking about, okay, what would be the best way to really like present this kind of thing. So let's assume, okay, you are the data person. So you basically really created a setup that can really showcase, okay, this is how everything was working so far. I can really showcase, okay, we get most of the people by these kind of channels. We have this different kind of, let's say, cohorts that are running like this. So from your experience, how do you get the other people involved, let's say the new people or the other people, let's say also like the people that were there, to really showcase, hey, this is what we do right now? I mean, it's definitely not sending over a dashboard and saying, hey, so this is it. So do you have some best practices what works really good? So it's really like hands-on working, or
it's worth just treating it organization by organization. I can talk through some of the things. Like, one is I'm a firm believer in the embedded org model. There's some people who do Center for Excellence data teams, and I just don't believe in it. I think you have to get direct partnership, because people.
How would you just as a step back for people who are not familiar?
I realized that halfway through I should define these things. So there's a set of data teams out there which I operate under what I call a Center for Excellence model, which is they have everyone's reporting up through a data team, and they kind of determine their own work. Other teams will work with them via like submitting a ticket or something like that. Be like, hey, this product team needs some answers. They're going to submit a ticket, and then this team is internally going to like triage it and then spit out an answer at the other end. And so there's kind of this API of working between the data team and others in the centralized thing. The big downside I see of that is that you just don't build the relationships, and you lose the soft power, the soft political power to affect things. The benefit, of course, is that you can triage that work, and you end up doing less what you might call like low stakes data polls and stuff like that, because you're only doing the highest priority ticket. Now, of course, de facto, I think that's actually not true for a variety of reasons, but that's the theory behind it. The embedded model says you have a dotted line relationship where you are living on your product team or your marketing team or your finance team or whatever. You're attending all of their weekly calls. You have this very close relationship, in some ways closer to them than even the data team. Now, that doesn't mean you should report through the other teams for a variety of reasons. I think there's moral hazard created when analysts report through the respective stakeholders, given that data is supposed to be an accountability measure. But you have a dotted line, close-knit relationship with those things. And that lets you not just deliver the asks, but also like identify unique things, the questions that are not being asked, the things that are always causing issues. That's a big part of this.
And I think what really, I believe in the same thing. So, and for example, my reason is like, when you are basically embedded in a different kind of team, you are in the situations that afterwards no one can basically recall when you ask them about, okay, what kind of data will help. So you are in this meeting where they're really struggling. Let's say you're on the marketing team, and so they're really struggling with some specific kind of campaigns that they have, if they're running, let's say, sufficiently or not, or they see really weird, let's say, conversion rates and so on. And so you are there. So you can first of all, you can lead and frame the conversation from the first second it appears. And second of all, you have all the context because like you're there. And for me, this is often like the part that is so much missing, because like trying to get this out of these people afterwards, sometimes it's not even possible, just because like let's say the details go away after some time, or it takes pretty good interview skills to do this. And so, and there it comes for free. So you're just there and you just pick the stuff up.
Totally.
And so you already mentioned it. So at some point you made the decision to first of all, you had two decisions. So I don't know if the second one was really like a decision as well, but let's say you made the decision to say, okay, I want to get out of my data roles, and so I want to become a CEO and do a lot of more different kind of stuff. So what triggered that?
Yeah, well, becoming CEO, the big reason was, I was at Airbnb, 2012, 2017, and it was a great ride. And, I learned a lot, met a lot of great people, but I was always captivated by the idea that the hardest problems in Airbnb were solved before I got there. How do you convince someone to stay in a stranger's home? How do you build the founding team? How do you, establish a mission that is captivating, that draws talent? And so I really wanted to do it almost from the intellectual challenge of just solving every problem of this holistic company building problem, and have that feeling like at the end, you have this successfully thriving thing that's employing people and helping people all over the place. So really wanted to do that. And, just with the trend of modern data stack and how it's, happened, I was writing some essays that I was sharing around with friends that were basically saying like, my last two jobs were very different than the previous ones. We went from the huge mess of trying to bootstrap open source distributed clusters to like just paying Snowflake some money, putting dbt on top, getting Fivetran in there. And it's like, you can get up and running so fast and with this highly centralized, scalable, performant thing. And so I was like, okay, things have changed here. What does that mean? And my general take was that all of the sort of higher order problems that you solve once you can have a general working relationship with data, it was the time for them. And so that's where I was exploring ideas, and especially this experimentation one, where it's like, my theory is that now with data warehousing technology, modern data stack, is that people are going to get to the experimentation point much faster.
Oh, that's interesting. Why do you think it's that?
Because experimentation has always had the property, A/B experiments have always had the property that the ROI is really clear. Like, it's just stupidly clear. It's like the opportunity cost of not running experiments is actually something you can't really afford. I mean, one of the stats I always like to say is if you look at places like Airbnb or Facebook or whatever, one of the facts that's just thrown in your face all the time is that the actual rate of success of product is low. despite all the focus groups you do, all the research you do, all the prep and analysis you do, it turns out only like 20% of the things you ship are going to move a metric in any meaningful way. And that's, there've been papers out of Airbnb, Netflix, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft, whatever, even among growth companies, all of our customers, we see similar rates. It's just the absolute truth that if you want to avoid wasting a bunch of time and you want to figure out what to celebrate and what not to, you have to run A/B experiments. And so the ROI has always been really clear. The demand has been really bolstered by people who have experienced great experimentation cultures at places like Airbnb and Amazon, and now have gone to other companies. The thing that's always interfered with it is that it's such a data intensive process. Experimentation is much more about analysis than anything else. And so to build a great third-party commercial tool, you needed that kind of scalable, elastic, performance, centralized thing to exist.
So we definitely come back to the analysis bit, because I think this is definitely something that's just totally underestimated and sometimes too often to ignore. But let's start at the other point where what you just said is okay, let's assume. So I think this is a great prep talk for product teams. So you basically sit in a meeting, you discuss different kind of features, and you can basically tell, hey, from this, 10 ideas, these, let's say these 2 might do an impact. Everyone else is basically just wasting the time. So how do you design a process that you can basically make sure, let's say you really have these kind of 10 ideas. So you did some interviews. So you have some kind of ideas where people are struggling. And so you develop your hypothesis, what you want to build as kind of features. And I think this is definitely true. So if you just do this, you come up with hypotheses that will not change anything. And so, but what do you do? So let's say you really have this, let's say, slate of 10 ideas, what you can build. So at which point do you start to introduce experimentation, or do you basically already do the whole design process from that point with experimentation in mind? So what is your best experience?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on the company and maturity scale. If you are a smaller company, it's going to take longer to get sufficient data to get statistical significance. And so early on, you might do a lot more qualitative de-risking before getting something out in the world. But once you're getting to Airbnb and Amazon scale, you might just get the A/B experiment out really fast and just have that be some of your earliest de-risking, because you can get results pretty quickly. So it depends on that, and then of course it depends on your infrastructure. One of the things you alluded to is how there's one form of experimentation culture, which is a product team sitting down and coming up with hypotheses and prioritizing them and doing a whole impact versus effort sort of 2x2. There's also a ton of impact that happens when you just democratize it, let engineers try things out. You create less information structure for it. And you need both, to be clear. I think if the pure, democratized spaghetti at the wall type of thing has its own kind of issues, but one of the stories I always like to say is if you look at Airbnb, the years I was there, the 5 years, the most impactful experiment we ever ran was making it so that clicking on the Airbnb listing opened up a new tab. That one thing boosted revenue way more than all of these other sitting down prioritization product team things. And that only would have happened if you had enabled engineers to try stuff out. So
that's interesting. Yeah.
And every company's got stories like these. Every company, the huge amount of impact that came from the small change.
But how do you approach that? So okay, I get it. So we don't speak about full demo. Let's say everyone can basically run. Let's say, hey, I have an idea. Basically, run my experiment. But how do you open it up? Because this is something which I rarely really see. So but how you can do
that's
this?
Part of why Eppo exists is that it leans on your infrastructure, right? Because you have to put people in guardrails. If you're gonna let everyone let it fly, you need a lot of guardrails and kind of methodological guidance. So one is you have to be aware when experiments are happening. So you need some amount of centralization to make it happen. It can't be happening secretly, taking some metric. 2, everyone has to make all the right choices by default. And there's a lot of choices in experimentation, right? There's
what kind of choices are, let's say 4 or 5 ones which are really important to take into account.
So let's start off. One is who's going to see the experiment or not. Is it going to be everyone or just people on mobile, whatever else it's going to be. That one people can actually navigate fairly well in my experience. 2, what metrics are you trying to drive? Which, if your leadership has done its job, then that's provided for you. And you kind of know like the goal of this year is, transactions or revenue or margin, whatever it is, right? Reducing, support requests, whatever the big priorities of the year, those metrics are supplied for you. And of course, you need the actual right definitions of those. If people are on the fly coming up with definitions of things, then it's a big mess. So 2 is like, what type of metrics are you trying to drive?
Yeah.
3 is how long to run the experiment. This gets into the weeds on statistics, but there's this concept called statistical power, where you have to run this calculation to figure out how long to run an experiment. So again, great infra like Eppo can automate that for you. And so no one has to know that this thing called power analysis exists. You're just kind of told whether to stop or continue, sort of thing. Another is kind of diagnostics writ large. So there are various ways in which experiment setup can be flawed. The classic one is a traffic imbalance. You think it's 50-50. It's actually like 49%, 51% splits. And that usually is indicative of something bad. And so you have to run this sort of check called the sample ratio mismatch check. So again, that's if you work at a place like Airbnb or whatever, it's just automated for you. You just get a little red signal in Slack or whatever if something's wrong. And then there's kind of, again, gets into the weeds a little bit, but there are things like outliers and whales. Every business, business commerce is not like some physical law. It's a social thing. And that usually leads to, black swan type outliers that will drive entire experiments. And so you need some strategy around it. A great experiment infra will, again, make those choices for you by automatically Windsorizing things at 99%, take everything above 99th percentile and kind of clip it, that sort of thing. There are other methods like Kubit, which is, this advanced statistical technique that reduces variance and helps with outliers. So I'm just saying a lot of things, understanding that perhaps the audience may or may not know all of them, but great infra just takes away a lot of these choices and just makes it so that an engineer throwing up an experiment is automatically going to be rigorous and trustworthy. Like it's going to, you don't have to push a lot of expertise on them. The infra is just taking care of a lot of the stuff.
And I think what I always try to, or what you just said reminds me is it definitely also helps. I mean, first of all, you have stuff where you can say, okay, I don't really need kind of a tool. So it's something I might do myself and so on. So I mean, if you really have a small scale setup, you don't need dbt to orchestrate your SQL query, so you can do it in a different way. When it comes to A/B testing, for me, just because of what you just said, I always would want to have a layer on top of that, because like I don't really want to figure this out all the time. And because like if I would do this, then everyone else would do it as well. And as you just said, then everyone else comes with their own interpretation of the whole thing. And
totally. And then it becomes really low trust. So much of the power of experimentation is buy-in. It's the idea that we're going to let this kind of, this system adjudicate things. It's going to, I say all the time, the thing about experimentation, we haven't even gone into the warehouse native importance of the whole thing, but a big thing about experimentation is that it's high scrutiny. This stuff is going to matter. It's not like the dashboard you throw out there that is sort of like, oh, that's nice to know. This is something that's going to decide whether code is dismantled. Code that took weeks to build is going to get dismantled, or whether people are going to get promoted. Teams that are going to be thought of as like, great improvers of metrics, or whether ideas are going to be entombed in institutional knowledge. I think all the time, take like the sort of product leaders, the people writing on Reforge and stuff like that. Like these people have these frameworks that make them believe this is a certain way to do product. How do they know those frameworks worked? Because they ran experiments that show they moved metrics of them. Like this is institutional knowledge driving. So it's really high scrutiny, which requires collective belief. And the more you kind of fragment decision-making and you kind of lead to this low trust process, you're not going to get there.
That's right. So one thing, I think I'm still circling around this as I said, I have to go on holidays. Okay, make it available for everyone, or at least like for more people, and which is really interesting. But how do you make maybe let's say a kind of meta process on top of that that keeps people getting better to run these kind of stuff? I mean, so I can, let's say I'm either a product person or I'm a developer. I get an idea, I run an experiment. It's interesting, but I also figured out, okay, it doesn't really change a lot because like maybe it was the wrong angle. So I basically, so how do I get a process in place that people basically in the end come together and share this stuff and say, hey, look, I did it like this and so on. So do you have some experience there?
Definitely. I mean, this gets into, like, so assume you have infra that's taking away a lot of the execution failures, because no one likes to be thought of as a poor executor. So get rid of the execution failures with good infra. Now let's get into just the culture of experimentation. I think this is something where, there's a few ways to go. One is, are you celebrating wins properly? Suppose you run some experiment, you actually move the metric. You should evangelize this. It needs to be kind of made aware, because it's such a great moment when you have that confidence that, like, I moved the metric. I controlled for every other factor out there because I randomized and, measured things. So one thing is celebrating. The second thing is, like, suppose you didn't move a metric. Failure to move a metric doesn't have to be signs of anything bad. Like, it's okay to fail, right? That is good. That's the whole purpose of an experiment, right? What you want to do, though, is, like, make sure you made kind of the right moves along the way and that you actually pieced out the data. So one of the things great infra, again, like Eppo will do, is make it really easy to, like, slice it by segmentations. Like, maybe it worked for some people and not others. A very common situation, for example, at Airbnb would be that, the experiment was broadly successful, except it was highly negative on Internet Explorer or something like that. And like that, this is back in the days when Internet Explorer had a ton of bugs and much issues. Or it was highly impactful in, like, North America and Europe, but it was, bad in Asia. Perhaps it was due to time zones and some of the synchrony around that. You want to, like, be able to dig deeper and figure out if there's any trends, or it could just be pure, like, just out of the business and diversity of it. At Webflow, where we ran all these experiments that were, highly effective for business users, these kind of, like, low technical background users, but the high technical background users, these designers, the power users, they wanted just completely different things, just opposite directions, right? One wanted a power tool and one wanted a sort of sandbox guided thing. And so, like, it's okay to not move a metric collectively if you start learning really rapidly. So basically, if you can celebrate failures to move metric, if you celebrate that you learned something from it. And being able to learn is a combination of, like, analytical horsepower to do these slice, dice, and funnels, as well as just, did you design questions in a way where, like, the failure to move metric, it actually might teach you something, that this is, like, not a direction to pursue.
How do you do the learning aspect more accessible? So, I mean, of course, like, let's say every experiment is, so let's assume you use a tool. So every experiment is in this tool. Sometimes these tools force you to at least, like, give some kind of context, what you wanted to do. But of course, like, it's always depending on the person that is entering this stuff. So what are steps beyond to really, like, because I really like this idea of learning, because I think this is in the end the essential thing, because you automatically get better. You just find something out, and usually when you find something else, you get better. Can put it into context. Maybe people can pick it up and can say, oh yeah, that's interesting. Maybe I do something else. So, but what are maybe even better ways to make these learnings accessible and easier to spread within a company, that people basically really pick it up? Is it just a culture thing, or there are basically also, like, some methods how you can do that?
It's a combination of culture and infra. I think we all have used tools that have sort of, like, viral evangelical components to them. It's just very easy to get internal virality and spread them around. I think, so one thing I see all the time are people who, like, will have in some in-house experimentation framework, but it's completely inscrutable to anyone who doesn't know it in and out. Like, it's all in a Jupyter notebook or something, and it's got just cells everywhere and, a bunch of text and artifacts and stuff. And so if you were to just put this in front of some PM without context, they'll be lost, completely lost, right? And then you're asking them not only to understand what they're seeing, but to, like, for them to champion that result to their manager. Like, that's where things get cut off. So you need something that's kind of, like, really out there in the open, meant for broad consumption. And it's, again, one of the big things I took to Eppo is that, like, can you bring Airbnb quality design to the experimentation process? Something that's very intentionally built for kind of a low context user. Then you can also do things like automating the sharing process. Can you generate presentations and PDFs and stuff that is, like, easier to spread on email? It doesn't require authorization and stuff, like, auth login stuff. Like, there's just a lot more you can do to decrease the friction of reading a report. And this stuff really matters. I don't know. Have you, like, I worked on this project called the Knowledge Repo at Airbnb, which was this, like, kind of collaborative notebook, like, knowledge-based thing.
I read the post about it.
Yeah, and it was very telling to me to see how successful that was when you actually start considering these low context users very seriously in the spread of knowledge. So there's a lot of that, but part of it as well is that like people get more bought into learning and experimentation if they were kind of brought along the entire way from conception to execution to, everything.
What maybe just, I don't know if you can explain it, but what made it like this that you do these, or that you did these things or still do these things at Airbnb? That, I mean, of course, like you write about it, so I never was there, but when you read about the stuff that has been written, that like it was always like a core thing that like data team building data products or making data more accessible, and so like this really like outreach to go to other people. So is there a root cause for that? Is it was just by accident because some people tried it and it really worked well?
Experimentation?
Yeah, in experimentation, but general, like this, let's say this attitude of data teams to go beyond, to not just be the data team, but also do this outreach and build these kind of tools that help people to do
this stuff. Was something that I think Airbnb got really right. If you really get to the core of what made the Airbnb data team so successful over time. And I really want to emphasize, when I joined, like it was not a kind of world-renowned data team at all. Like we were doing very shallow stuff. It wasn't that big. The thing that I think the early data leader got right, this guy named Riley Newman, what he really got right was just focusing on impact. Like there was no ability to kind of get promoted or get rewarded for just like producing a dashboard or producing a model or anything like that. Like you needed to have the entire story about how this thing led to this action that, if you were to just say that out loud, it would be like obvious to everyone that this changed Airbnb. And so once you just have this really holistic version of impact and you don't just take data work as like self-evidently good, it just changes so many things. Like it's just like, it's not enough to just create this technical wizardry. It's like, tell me how money came out the other end or how some strategic goal came out the other end.
Well, this is interesting because like this, I mean, and I want to go back to experimentation again. Is like, so how important and how basically also like blocking can leadership be in this whole process?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know. And so let's assume like, I don't know, head of product, CPO, CMO, whatever.
Other things that we're calling out Airbnb. I have the utmost respect. I think it's one of the people I most admire in the world is Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb. But let's be clear, he is not Jeff Bezos in his mentality. He is not someone who is automatically reaching for kind of data and empiricism and stuff like that. He idolizes Walt Disney and people who can kind of have a more internal sort of process. And so this is part of why you had to have this impact story, is like there was not some like on high belief in technical wizardry being, obviously good. And this is why I was really big into experimentation, because if you were there that early Airbnb, this kind of 2012, 2014 period, the reason that the Airbnb data team became highly accoladed was experimentation. That was the thing. That was what changed the game, because it suddenly took data from this sort of like kind of insights generating sort of support function into something that is like building entrepreneurial culture, building meritocracy. It's taking something like, now this person like knows their direct relationship to a metric, controlling for seasonality, controlling for all the other products going on, controlling for marketing, like no caveats whatsoever. Whether your work increased or decreased the metric. And that was like, what's great about that is that now we're not talking about like, metrics and segmentations and stuff like that. Now we're just talking about like entrepreneurialism, ideas, quality of ideas, like what worked and what didn't. And so that really changed the game. And so suddenly it went from trying to get people to read data analysis to them coming to us being like, this experiment didn't move the metric. Can you help me understand why?
Yeah. So, but I think this is really, so let's say if someone in a data team is listening and their job is like to creating all these different kind of dashboards, I would definitely say this is one of the takeaway. So build out a plan how you can maybe really like go into experimentation and put this as your force or like as your superpowers that you can bring into the companies. one thing that you definitely require is like, you definitely need some collaboration with, let's say, product engineers, software engineers in general. It's like, I mean, you need this technical implementation that it can work. So from your experience, so first of all, how hard is that? And on the other hand, like, what are good ways to do that? I mean, so put it like this: feature flagging, which is kind of the source of everything, software teams use this as well, because like it's a very useful thing. So, and I think more and more software teams, whereas feature flagging becomes natural. So if you are in a company and you ask your software developers and they say, yes, of course we do feature flagging, then, I mean, then you already have the entry door. But if it's not like that, so how can you approach that?
Yeah, and what's more, a lot of feature flagging tools aren't really built for experimentation. So even if you have it, you might not be quite completely there. Yeah, and this gets into a little bit more of like the embedded model. It's like, similarly, if you were a data team supporting marketing, you got to get buy-in from that team and, you know, the technical resources they can muster. But to get buy-in from engineers and other folks to make the investment to make experimentation happen, one is, you know, tools like Eppo are going to make it a lot easier. It goes from a kind of year-long slog to just like, you know, up and running very quickly. But two, it's, you know, data team building these sort of relationships and building these coalitions is just part of the job. You know, this is really, if you want people to kind of have more metric-oriented point of views, like, you actually need to get people excited about this sort of thing. Now, the good news is that in a lot of companies, like, product and engineering themselves want to run experiments. Like, there's actually multiple voices in there. And especially if you have a growth team or a machine learning team, like growth or AI, these are two teams that structurally have to run experiments. Their job is literally impossible without it, because, you know, how do you know one machine learning model is better than another? You got to run an A/B experiment. You know, how do you know that this little tweak of, you know, lowering the friction was actually good? You got to run an experiment. You know, for these two types of teams, like, they literally can't do the job without it.
Before we went live, you basically said one thing that is often missed and not really, like, how to say, doesn't really get the right attention, is the analysis. So what makes it so important
in experimentation? Yeah,
exactly.
In some ways, it's sort of obvious, because, like, you know, why do we run experiments? It's to actually understand what performed better than another. It's like, you know, this.
But in the end, like, most of the people that I know, they run an experiment. They look, okay, is it significant? Can I use it? Can I roll it out? But it's not really there. So you have to do a lot more stuff to bring context into it, to make the right learnings from that. And so this is, I think, more complex.
Yeah, it's a deep topic. You know, we talked about some of the stuff earlier around, you know, statistical validity, around data quality, around, you know, handling some of these exceptions and diagnostics and stuff like that. So it's a deep problem. And all of those problems are just very data plane centric, very analysis centric. Like, how do you know it's set up properly? You you count up the number of users in both groups, and you run this kind of randomization check, sample ratio mismatch check. That's essentially an analysis process. You know, you're going to run it in your warehouse. You're going to use off that data. You know, how do you understand if outliers exist and control for them? That's, again, a data process. So, you know, analysis writ large is just like, how can you use the exhaust, the events, the metrics produced by the thing to understand, like, am I reading something trustworthy? If so, is there something to uncover here? And then, you know, how do you package up and analyze that? That's kind of, in the end, is all a big analysis process. And I think it's really what a lot of the previous generation of experimentation tools missed.
And this is then something that, I mean, we talked about this embedded model. So, and what you just described calls out, at least like for some people who know this stuff a little bit better than others, and also like be a helping hand. So to say, hey, I want to run an experiment, but I don't really know what to do. So that you basically have people saying, hey, yeah, come around. So we do this together. I help you a little bit, and so on.
Yeah, I have noticed most companies that go this experimentation direction, they'll have like one person who you might call an experiment expert. You know, maybe they ran a program, or they had some very experimentation centric role at some previous company. I think it's fair to say that, like, having one of those really, really helps you out. Now, the big thing infra can get you, like dedicated infra, is that one person's can be scaled out across an org. You know, one of the things I think about all the time, you know, I was at Webflow, 200-person company, you know, early data hire. I was the only one who had ever run an experiment before. And so, like, there was a lot of just like this kind of guided support thing. Like, I built the infrastructure very similar to what we had at Airbnb. So the ability to set it up and do it was very easy, but the design element, the front end, the UX didn't do a lot for me in terms of support. It was just kind of spitting out numbers. And in a lot of ways, that was the impetus to start Eppo, is to say, like, you not only need that kind of performant Airbnb style infra, you also need like very carefully thought out design UX that puts the right type of decisions in front of the right people, right? So like data people decide how to pull a metric with SQL. Engineers are going to use the SDKs to set things up. And then, business users, or kind of anyone is going to take these results and package them, send them around the org, in some kind of easily interpreted way. So, how do you scale out experiment expertise? The combination of technology and design.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. Final thing, because I know I have some people that I work with that will definitely ask me and will not be happy when I haven't asked you. Yeah. So I work a lot with software as a service in these early stages. So they have the problem that you just described. So they might have, I don't know, 200, 300 active users in that kind of product, sometimes even less. And so is this something where you just say, okay, it just doesn't make sense to do experimentation, basically then go on, do qualitative interviews, do some testing there and so on. So, or are there ways to handle this? So where's like the step where you can say, okay, now.
Yeah, this is probably where I have a probably stronger opinion than most in the experimentation world. If you have like 200, 300 users, I really think you probably shouldn't be running A/B experiments. Like, I think the sample size is some kind of cold, hard math that kind of dictates when the process is appropriate. Run a power analysis, see what type of effect size you can say. I know there are a lot of other vendors and a lot of influencers out there who'll be like, no, the good thing is you can still detect really high impact changes, the low-hanging fruit that's going to boost your metric by like 100% or 50%. And I just think in practice that that type of stuff, like, it's more likely you're going to end up with a false positive because of some kind of underpowered effect. So I think instead what you can do is an experimental mindset, which is something closer to like, you're about to go this direction in product. What are the riskiest things? Whether it's UX or technical feasibility or whatever it is, can you peel those out and test those early and perhaps in a more qualitative sense or whatever else it is? How can you de-risk things really early on? So I don't know if you ever read books by Marty Kagan, like Inspired and those sort of things. I think that's the first step.
The funny thing about me is like when I was starting out in product officially, and this was at Audible, my first week at the job was basically workshop with Marty Kagan. So he set all the foundation. So like it's, but you're right. I think this was one of the part that I think he planted in my head, was like to test out as early as possible, because like product people have worked. Exactly. Mm-hmm. And another thing, so I think this was the stuff that really, why I can still remember it, was like he said, product persons fall in love pretty quickly with their ideas.
Yeah.
It's something naturally happens. And I mean, it happened to me multiple times. And you have to make sure that you quickly test it. Because like the longer you wait, the more in love you are, the harder you can separate, and so on. And it really becomes complicated if you do it really quite early. And you're right as well. I think this is something which sometimes is also like underestimated. Is like there are definitely ways to test out even complex features in a very lo-fi and very, let's say, abstract way, where you can already, when you know where are the risks, where you can really like see, okay, it can make sense or not. Okay.
Totally. It's just worth it. Like you can, when you're about to build a product, you can know early on, is the riskiest thing, like, will it work? A technical feasibility thing, in which case an engineering spike is probably the appropriate place to start. Is the problem that this is kind of complicated UX wise, in which case a mock-up in UX studies is probably a good way to start. If the riskiest thing just value, like, will people care? Then like, there's a bunch of discovery conversations you can have there. So there's a lot of steps you can do, and I always push on people that like, people who jump straight into code and stuff like that, like code has this great capability that it scales and it's robust and stuff like that, but it has this downside that it's rigid. It's hard to
exactly,
right? So you should really do a lot of de-risking before you hit code as much as possible.
Yeah, I'm always telling product teams like, let's say, let's assume this is like the developers are your gold reserve, and you really want to make sure that you just put stuff there really is worth it to be able to
Totally.
take up the time.
But yeah, around the small sample size thing, I mean, this is just my plea to the industry, to my fellow vendors and my fellow influencers, is like, so much of experimentation is a collective belief about rigor. You know, like people are willing to take this sort of trust fall exercise to be adjudicated by the data, so long as like it ends up with this sort of unimpeachable truth. And so, you know, this is part of why, you know, I'm willing to say, like, look, if you have really, really low sample size, it probably doesn't make sense for you. I don't think you should kind of engage with it. It might kind of degrade trust, you know, long term for when you actually are ready for it.
Exactly. So, I think this is the big problem. So you start out too early, you basically burn, let's say, this kind of approach, at least like for some years. And I think it's not worth it. So like maybe for people,
and to be clear, you should still do like feature flagging and roll. You know, there's stuff to like make sure the servers are still up. You know, the application work. Like there's hygiene of just like, you know, making sure you don't have degradations that you should still do. But like this sort of insight generating, you know, experimentation thing, that's something I'd be more wary about.
Yeah. So let's say for people, so okay, introduce feature flagging pretty early on, and then also like check. I mean, there are plenty of power calculators around the internet where you can just search for it and can just say, hey, I want to make a calculation, so these are my numbers. Can I run an experiment?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so I want to close with the lightning round, which I always, which is kind of my favorite thing. So, and I start something which is close to Eppo because like you're in the space. So, how much should we believe the hype about cloud data warehouse native? Oh, we definitely need a different term for that application. So let's say like you, I mean, Eppo builds directly on top of data warehouse data. So you don't really have to push data into there. So we can just say, hey, these are my tables. These are the data that we can work on, and please work with that. So how much should we trust this? I would not say it's a hype. So I think people mention it. It's not really like, I think, start to consider it. But do you think this is definitely the way how we build most of the data products in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yes.
Also, because you're biased, but
no, I strongly believe it. But look, like, the reasons why are actually just sort of easy to agree with, right? You know, the first is that GDPR exists. You know, privacy exists and security. Like, if you want to avoid having vendors hacked and having your information leaked all over the internet, you want to decrease the, you know, the amount of surface area of risk. So just having vendors that are not holding large swaths of, you know, PII data is important. I think that's just generally good for society as a starting point. Is like, you know, it's not always possible, but it's always a good place to start. The second thing is, if you're going to trust the data, every data team out there and probably every data adjacent person has dealt with the issues of synchronizing data across systems. You know, once you're in the world of egressing to another platform, like there's just a million reasons why it'll fall out of sync, especially compared to a sort of batch writing dbt Airflow process. So you want to have the most correct version, like aligning every system as fast as possible. And so that's a huge advantage at Warehouse Native. And then the last thing is, if you're dealing with a high scrutiny process like experimentation, at some point, someone's going to like want to dive deeper and understand exactly how this number came down. Exactly. And if you have a Warehouse Native product, you can trace it all the way down to the studs, start from the very bottom and see every single thing that produced that report. So just the amount of trust, the amount of risk reduction, and the amount of like overhead of getting to correct data is just dramatically lower. So yeah, you can count me Camp Warehouse Native here. I'm a big believer in it.
Yeah, me too. And for the reasons that you just mentioned, especially like this, I have control and I can really go down if I need to. And I can basically explain stuff and don't have this thing where I have to put somewhere and say, yeah, it's just a tool. I don't know. So it's a black box. I have no idea what they do.
Once you're already spending so much resources getting correct data in this warehouse, centralized place, like to have to just do the same thing again, except in a black box third party, it's really annoying. You know, I won't name names on certain other product analytics vendors, but I've definitely had onboardings that have taken like 5-6 months because the data was always out of sync and wrong. And then we eventually kind of gave up on it because, you know, our core metrics were Stripe data and that was not available in this product analytics vendor.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so we have to have at least one question about AI. So is AI really, let's say, so I heard different kind of, let's say, dimensions of that. So let's say I would say the soft dimensions are really like it's the next iPhone, or like it's the next iPhone moment. some people I just listened to yesterday, they were like, it's like the phase in the, I think it was in the 30s or 40s, where basically agriculture went from fully manual to totally mostly automated work with tractors and so on, which basically changed the whole thing. I mean, like, you had 70% of people in agriculture, and then after 10 years, you just had, I don't know, 3 or 4%, which is like, I mean, it's a massive shift. So which kind of dimension are we speaking of, or is it?
Totally. I mean, look, you can call me generally an AI believer. You know, I think part of it is I've worked in this stuff for a while. I've like made a bunch of language models before the Gen AI thing came around. And, you know, the way I think about it is like, we went from the thing where models were like a, you know, 2-year-old just spouting random words to something that's closer to like a teenager or something. You know, just something that's like kind of fluid and knows some stuff, even has obvious gaps. I think it's anyone who claims to know exactly how it's going to turn out is like, things are changing so quickly, like just so dramatically quickly, and a new echelon of model quality is just going to change it even more. So I think it's a little hard to predict the future. The things I will say about AI though are, with all these startups and all these efforts, there's going to be probably a few big winners and a bunch of losers, just like, you know, 2001 had the sort of .com things that had a bunch of, you know, pets.com, but it also had Amazon. You have the, you know, iPhone delivery app phase that had a whole bunch of like alcohol delivery, grocery delivery, but then Uber. And, you know, we're about to enter another one of those where there's probably going to be some big emergent platforms and a bunch of other failures. And that's fine. That's great. That's how technology works. I think the important thing, though, is that AI, just like the machine learning world before, just like all the search ranking and personalization and everything else that was probabilistic and model done, it's really an A/B experimentation game. Like, it's really, if you want this thing to drive metrics, like if you want this thing to actually be value additive as opposed to just kind of like, you know, just the cool looking thing, like you have to run this A/B experiment, make sure it moves things. And one of the stats I like to say is if you look at Airbnb's search ranking team, you know, this is one of the most high performing teams of that era of Airbnb search ranking. They had this problem, which was, they were creating these ever more sophisticated models, but you would never know they were value additive because the search ranking system looked identical. It still just showed 20 listings in a map. And it's like, who's to say one is better than another? You basically need an A/B experiment to do it. And, you know, the offline simulations you do, these kind of like local experiments, these like kind of within data set things, you know, every model we put out looked great in those, right? I mean, definitionally, we wouldn't have launched something if it didn't look great in those. And something like 30% of them actually moved a metric. There's a bunch of reasons why, you know, from data drift to like seasonality changes to, you know, data leakage. There's a million reasons why the offline simulation will not reflect to online. So, you know, we're very excited because, you know, a rise of AI basically means a lot more ideas tested.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, speaking about technology, last time you used Excel or Google Sheets?
Oh, Excel or Google Sheets?
Yeah, when was the last time you used it?
But, you know, I don't know. I think I'm pretty funny because I think I'm quite effective at a lot of modern data tools, but I'm still such a novice in Excel. I don't know how that exactly happened, but.
Okay, so it's good. So you don't export stuff to Excel.
Yeah, very rarely. Cool. If I do, it's just cool. A line graph or something like
that. People from data products will love you about that. Okay, moving out of data, one place that you definitely want to travel to, but haven't managed it yet, but it's really high on your list.
Yeah, let's see. You know, it's very unlikely to happen due to a bunch of geopolitics, but I'd love to go to Iran someday.
Okay.
You know, talk about some like, you know, incredible history, incredible culture.
Yeah.
You know, it's got all this nature variety and stuff. You know, I think it's got a lot of intriguing stuff. It's produced like incredible talent, you know. So I'd love to go. I just don't know when it's going to be possible.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. A friend of mine went there and he was blown away. He said like it's amazing. So it's I can imagine. Okay, so the last one. This is I had it already like in the last 3 episodes. Already interesting answers to that. So let's put it like this. So you want to run an experiment, but you struggle because like your feature flagging wasn't really working, like your transformation for the data that you want to prepare was not working. So sometimes this typical, sometimes frustrating data days that can happen. what is the best food to basically brighten up your mood and to make you forget all this nasty data things? What is the stuff that you like?
Coffee. Yeah.
Coffee, just coffee.
That'll put you in a good mood. I mean, yeah, I think there's like, especially if I have some like kind of rote kind of data reconciliation annoying task, I love just like settling in, getting a coffee, putting on some music, and just kind of getting through it.
And is it then like a normal coffee, or is it like enhanced coffee?
I love black coffee. Yeah, okay. Black coffee. Yeah.
And no like filter or any kind of weird stuff that you can do.
No. Yeah, freshly brewed black coffee.
Perfect. Well, that's good. Thank you so much. That was
absolutely. Thanks, Timo. This has been a pleasure.
It was. I skipped over 10 really good questions, so maybe at some point we should.
Yeah, let's get back together. There's a lot more we can go into.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for watching.